I wanted to start by bracketing this with my experience in this space. And Xavier, if you wouldn't mind just throwing up the next illustration. Couldn't excise the one on the right. Sorry, the one facing you. That's me in grade 1. And I'm confident the Griffith Society doesn't have any snowflakes who'll be triggered by former male shots and dead naming, as it's called at the ABC. Benjamin Law would resign at the sight of these. But the point about the photograph in military uniform is that I had graduated from the Royal Military College in December 1977, and that photograph was taken at the end of January 1978. And there's reason for that being significant. It was a couple of weeks before the Hilton bombing, which, as many of you would recall, saw a very large call out of armed Australian troops on the streets of Australian townships, most notably Bowral and Mittagong. The bombing itself led to the Anandamaga investigations, which most of those convictions ultimately, I'm pretty sure, were quashed. Siri, who was the main informant, turned out to not be a terrific Crown witness. And as a consequence, we've ended up with Tim Anderson having an academic career, much to the nation's sorrow. And although it did yield Alistair versus the Queen, which remains the best common law authority, I gather, on attempt under the criminal law as it applies to sections 344 and 45 of the New South Wales Crimes Act. So you can move those on if you like, Xavier, and we'll go to the next ones. Bracketing my military career is that shot from 2018. And that is on the bridge of HMAS Adelaide, about to depart Melbourne, prior to going into the Bass Strait, where we executed a couple of interesting manoeuvres. We went to the oil rigs and embarked Tag West, and you can move it on to the next one if you like, mate. That's just to give you some glimpse of what a large piece of kit it is. That's out in the Tasman Sea. Incidentally, all these have been declassified. Nothing I'm telling you is problematic. The photographs are declassified, and the material I'm imparting is not compartmented. We went out into the Bass Strait, and Tactical Assault Group West, based on the Special Air Service Regiment, has a particular suite of capabilities that allow it to seize back Bass Strait oil rigs should they fall into the wrong hands. And the TAG was embarked on Adelaide as we then executed a left turn and went up the east coast. Purpose of the mission primarily was to do two things. One, to provide a CT counter-terrorism response on standby off the Commonwealth Games being conducted at the Gold Coast. And Adelaide, being the formidable platform it is, does have a 50-bed medical capability, including ICU, critical care specialists, anaesthetists, and is capable of dealing with gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds, and so on, because its primary war purpose is to insert littoral forces across beachheads. It can embark a number of Abrams tanks. It can put the better part of an infantry brigade aboard and disembark them. Look, I won't get too far down into the weeds, but it's pretty vulnerable to the latest anti-access D-21 suite of sea skimming missiles. So it would essentially be useful in permissive or semi-permissive environments, but for the purpose it was being used in 2018, it was a very, very formidable capability. And we moored off Gold Coast to provide redundancy in the event of a mass casualty attack, and also to have the team of hitters on board in the event there was a situation that required a pretty high-end breach or a hostage situation, or to take down a terrorist cell. So that was the purpose. You just to give you another indication, we've got another shot when we just pulled into Sydney to decamp a couple of people. That's the Manly Ferry. That gives you, and Pinchgut in the foreground. The visual distance, I'm not a mariner, as no doubt Anthony probably has worked out, but the indication is that the Manly Ferry would be roadkill to this thing. It displaces 30-odd thousand tonnes. If the Manly Ferry comes within a kilometre of that jump deck, it is invisible. And we were alongside briefly in Sydney to allow a couple of people off, and I won't go into the reasons for that. And then we ended up steaming north to the Gold Coast to complete the mission. And as it just happened, a cyclone hit Townsville at the same time. So we ended up extending the mission. We were deployed further in an aid to the civil power, or correction, aid to civil community task, but were turned around because the gravity of the situation didn't warrant our continuing with that mission. So you can wrap that one up as well if you like, and we'll go back to the screen. Look, coming to you tonight from the Australian Capital Territory, where unarmed members of the Australian Defence Force are patrolling the border with the police. And Andrew Barr, who I don't believe I'm doing him a disservice by saying he's pretty much Dan Andrews light, beat his chest a couple of days to use the term boots on the ground with great pride, to say that the border was being policed with boots on the ground. I may be defaming him, but I suspect it's the only Australian military deployment he's ever supported. But that is the situation as it stands this evening. Now, I want to just bracket it that the 1978 through to 2018 spanned the larger part of my military career. I was sworn in to resist the Queen's enemies on the 14th of January 1974 as a cadet at Duntroon. I can safely say I was part of a force that accomplished that mission. Meghan Markle notwithstanding, Her Majesty is still on the throne, and as of tonight, safe and well. So mission accomplished on that. But over that time, we went from a force that had just come out of Vietnam, a very combat experienced force with a superb combat ethos, and I left the force on the anniversary, 14 January this year, having obviously transitioned genders along the way and changed services along the way as well, not of any germane to this purpose tonight. But what has interested me was that I was oblivious, notwithstanding a passion for constitutional law, was oblivious to the passage of very, very substantial legislation, which I imagine as members of the Samuel Griffiths Society, many of you would look askance at. Now, the Bowral call-out caught all of us by surprise. I can still remember being aroused early. We were all on parade very early that day, and the CO addressed my battalion, the 8th 9th Battalion, and said, Australia's changed forever. There's been a terrorist incident on Australian soil. And we all took it deadly serious. A number of my classmates from the 5th 7th Battalion at Holsworthy were deployed with live rounds and were on the streets of Bowral forthwith. It was a credit to what in that era was one task force, subsequently morphed into one brigade and is now based out of Darwin. It's our heaviest brigade now. It always had the mechanised infantry cavalry component. So the 2nd Cavalry Regiment had armoured personnel carriers on every overpass on the Hume Highway. They airlifted the leaders from the Chogham Conference who were at the Hilton, and I think sent a decoy convoy from memory. That may be incorrect, but there was a pretty good op given the lack of notice that we had. But all of us were asking the question, including of embedded British soldiers and NCOs who were in that unit who had Northern Ireland experience exactly what ROE, rules of engagement, we could employ in the event of any hostile situation occurring. And the answer was pretty much a shrug of the shoulders. And no one actually came to attention and required application of lethal force. But this was the last time, I think I can say with some authority that this was the last time that a major deployment of the ADF was done entirely in accordance with the text, structure and spirit of the foundational constitution, in that Neville Wran, the Premier of New South Wales, requested the call out in a case of domestic violence, which was the intention of the founders, and the term domestic violence had been directly imported, I suspect, at Inglis Clark's behest as the primary student of the American instrument. It's a term used advisedly in the US context. It hasn't actually been the subject of any satisfactory judicial exposition in Australia, and I'll come back to that. But Malcom Fraser was at the Choggum conference, and I suspect may have been rather rattled by the occurrence of that blast in the hotel where the leaders were convening. Wran was also very disturbed, and I had the opportunity in his lifetime to speak to Wran about the events of that evening. And people were genuinely concerned that it was the start of something else that might have been more widespread, that there was a conspiracy. So in the end, lethal force was not used, but you had 2,000 odd Australian soldiers carrying live ammunition on Australian soil. And hold that thought, because none of the troops knew who they were looking for. No one had had time to print ROE cards, which on every other deployment I did, every operational deployment, we were briefed as to what our rules of engagement were, which when it was legitimate to drop someone and to apply lethal force. And we were drilled heavily on that. So it was an accident waiting to happen, which fortunately no one innocent was shot. The Brits who had done service in Northern Ireland were very, very valuable, I might add, in leavening the force that was deployed and urged restraint. And just as any of you who are veterans or have been in the military, while we're carrying full magazines, frontline ammunition, no one had a round up the spout, no one was at action at any stage, and various degrees of weapon readiness were not engaged, so no one was ever at instant or had a round up the spout. So the chances of any peremptory shooting of an innocent person was minimised in that regard. But we were making it up as we went, to be perfectly honest. Having said that, back to the Constitution and why a society of this nature should care. The intention was clearly envisaged that the colonies would hand over their military and naval forces under Section 69, that they would forsake raising naval and military forces pursuant to Section 114, and that the Commonwealth of Australia would, under Section 119, in cases of domestic violence, provide military support among the several states. And it was very much a concept that I think, as I said, reflects the American, if we have a Washminster Constitution, it's the Wash part rather than the Minster part, because as you will recall, the scepticism about standing armies, which animated the great constitutional settlement of 1689, and the fact that the Army Bill had to be passed annually for a long time, the deep common law concern about the great writ, habeas corpus, and suspicion of the executive, to which Dixon Sir Owen Dixon J, as he was in the Communist Party case, spoke eloquently of the executive being the greatest threat to the democratic polity, and made the point, and as did McTiernan in an eloquent judgment in that case, where they were very sceptical about the Commonwealth trying to recite itself into power under the defence power. Now, that was the high watermark, I suspect, of the black letter interpretation of the defence power. After 1978, a number of things happened. Justice Hope, who did the Royal Commission, you'll recall, a couple of Royal Commissions, in fact, he did a standing Royal Commission into the intelligence agencies and also an investigation into the Hilton bombing. Sir Richard Mark of the Metropolitan Police Force likewise analysed that, and I think the scepticism around the way the whole Bowral operation was conducted was very, very much warranted, and was done at the zenith of our Constitution functioning precisely as it was drafted. As a consequence of that, the recommendation from Sir Richard Mark was that a military capability be raised, which it was, and it became known as Tactical Assault Group West, embedded in the Special Air Service Regiment. Subsequently, TAG East embedded in 2 Commando, which in that original era of my service, 1 Commando was a reserve unit with a regular army commanding officer. It became part of the regular force as 4 RAR Commando after Timor interfet in 99, was removed from the Orbat and then re-raised as 2 RAR Commando in about 2004-5, and Tactical Assault Group East embedded in that force. So we've got a counter-terrorism capability and killing houses, so-called, where the troops do, I can assure you, almost daily live firing exercises in those facilities, and it is very impressive to be part of. She won't mind my taking her name in vain. I got Janet Albrechtsen an opportunity to be part of one of those, to act as a hostage inside when TAG East blew the door off and went in darkness with their laser sights and shot everything that needed to be shot with live hostages inside. That's the level of precision that these individuals achieve. Kimbeasley tells the amusing story, and this will give Nick a chortle, that Ros Kelly, when she was the Minister assisting in defence or defence support, went to the killing house in Western Australia and came out without batting an eyelid and said to Kim, "Isn't it great they were using blanks?" And Kim, with his great belly laugh, had to tell Ros that they'd actually been using live ammunition, and she nearly fainted in his arms. So they fire thousands of rounds while they're on standby as a tag, and that's rotated through the Sabre squadrons or the commando companies, and they reach a very high level of precision. And I wrote a piece which aged pretty well about the Lindt siege, arguing that they should have been deployed at the Lindt siege rather than the New South Wales Police, who succeeded in blinding themselves with their own stun grenade trying to get into the building. That would not have happened with either of the regular capabilities. The problem I have is the mission creep that has occurred with the best intentions in the world. The best scholarship on this, and I'll refer you to a gentleman called Michael Head, H-E-A-D. He's clearly not a member of this society, nor would he regard himself as a fellow traveller. He is of the left, as is probably most, other than Patrick Parkinson and James Allen and Augusto Zimmerman, probably just about every other legal academic in the country is pretty much a left-winger. So he started to develop the scepticism about calling out the troops from the perspective of a leftist who was concerned about the expansion of the defence power. I now think there would be many libertarians and members of this society who favour strict legalism and the Constitution as it was drafted, who would actually now start to share some of the scepticism, because without for one moment condoning what's gone on in the streets lately, I can see how decent Australians with helicopters hovering above their houses at night, curfews, and seeing albeit unarmed members of the ADF in the streets, after very substantial periods of lockdown, could get to a stage where their mental health and judgment is impaired enough to feel really, really besieged in their own country and can feel their liberties shrinking before their eyes. As an ex-officer, two things that I'd say. I'm very, very concerned reputation-wise for the ADF. I don't believe seeing it overused is good for its reputation and standing, because it is becoming more fraught and partisan as it stands now. Yep. Secondly, having commanded an infantry platoon and a rifle company, and also having deployed overseas with operational units, every single day that you are not doing your core warfighting preparation is a day you don't get back. And there are units of ours that have been more or less door knocking and stacking shelves in supply chains now for the better part of 18 months. Their warfighting skills are being treated. And I think that pragmatically is just not the best use of taxpayer funding. And the cruel paradox in this, and I've talked through this with Duncan Lewis and Jim Wallace, both of whom, Jim as DSAF, Director of Special Action Forces, before Special Operations Command was raised. Jim and I go a long way back, so does Duncan Lewis, who was at Duntroon with me a couple of years ahead of me. Duncan was the first Special Operations Commander Australia as a 2-star general. They both felt that the tag role was appropriate for the best of constitutional reasons. As very considered gentlemen, both of them, who care about our constitution, they believed that the militarisation of police forces was a greater threat to the liberties of Australians than the use of precision military forces in highly circumscribed cases. However, what we have seen, and where you can find this for those who wish to look at the legislation, there have been 3 major tranches of amendments to the Defence Act. In 2000, to authorise Operation Gold for the Olympic Games, which was pre-9/11, then in 2006, and again in 2018, cumulatively they fall under Part 3 Roman numerals, AAA uppercase, and from memory, I think they occupy sections 51I to Y, but that's broadly correct, if not totally precise. What they do is take us into a situation where the intent and the text and structure of our Constitution has been bypassed with bipartisan support by legislative instrument. And what Sir Owen Dixon warned about in the Communist Party case has been done. The Commonwealth has effectively recited itself into power. And it gives me no joy to say that 2 justices for whom I have enormous respect, Justice Gleeson, Chief Justice, and Callan and Jay, and Dyson Hayden in Thomas v Mowbray, did precisely what Owen Dixon warned against in Stenhouse and Coleman, and was vociferous in warning against in the Communist Party case, when he said the court may immerse itself in expert evidence that does not escape judicial notice, reputable historians and so on, and he referred to that in Obiter on the nature of global communism, while still striking down the relevant law. What Callan and Jay and Gleeson CJ did in Thomas v Mowbray was actually take judicial notice of open source reporting about the threat to Australia. Now, I'm sure they were well-intentioned, but I suspect in this room there would be unanimous approval that we don't want the High Court of Australia as the final bastion of interpretation and adherence to strict legalism. We don't want them reading defence correspondence in reputable newspapers to influence their judgments. We want them to adhere to the text, structure and spirit of our Constitution. And what we have seen in Part 3 AAA is an abbreviation now where the ADF can be called out not only by the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Attorney General and the Defence Minister. In certain circumstances, the CDF can advise the Governor General. Now, I found this preposterous, but that is the interpretation that is in Head's book, Calling Out the Troops by Federation Press, 2009. It's very, very sound scholarship, and I defer to him because he's immersed in the area. It made me really sit up and take notice that this has occurred virtually without debate. And Nick will perhaps raise an eyebrow that John Faulkner spoke fulsomely in favour of all these amendments when he was in the Senate. So Labor, I think, obviously have always been terrified of being wedged on national security. That explains why they're so acquiescent in what has occurred. But the checks and balances on the use of lethal force on Australian soil has now gone well beyond what was envisaged when the Bowral call-out was done according to the letter of the Constitution in 1978. And the distinction between two things, military aid to civil communities and military aid to the civil power, has, in my humble submission, morphed. And that is a very, very dangerous and slippery slope. For instance, and Nick, again, sorry to keep deferring to you on this, Nick, but you'd recall when John Howard used the ADF for military assistance on Indigenous communities where there was widespread substance abuse and so on. What the ADF was not crazy about taking on the task, but it gets its heels together and does what it does. That's at the lower end of infractions, in my view. What is going on today in the ACT, outside literally 3 blocks from my home, what is going on the streets of Melbourne, I think should be a matter of concern to every Australian. And I really don't think, even as disappointing as decisions like Love and Tom were, and Senator Stoker spoke superbly on this very forum as to why they were so disappointing and warranted reconsideration. I genuinely believe that someone with appropriate standing is entitled to take the unilateral use of the ADF to the High Court of Australia and challenge it, because I think it is I think it's abhorrent to see our troops doing contact tracing, going door to door in houses.
Absolutely right.
And I've had people who are loyal Sky viewers. One woman who runs a place that those who've been federal parliamentarians and some who are familiar with Canberra, the dear old Charcoal Grill, a great haunt of the Canberra bar. She's a woman from Eastern Europe, and I had not seen the potential for this. She came up and sat at my table when we were still able to dine there a couple of months back, because I've raised this issue on Sky a few times with Alan Jones and also on a program called In My View, more than once. She's from Eastern European, she's of Eastern European origin, and she said, "Thank you for speaking out against the oppression, because I fear, having fled communism, it makes my blood run cold," or words to that effect, to see soldiers in our streets. As an ex-officer, I had not had that perspective and life experience to feel that. It did very much make me start to interrogate where we've got to on this. So legislatively, it has gone a long, long way in the 21st century. Now, I am not for one moment derogating the war on terrorism. I am not one of those leftist columnists who uses inverted commas, so-called war on terror. I believe there is an ongoing extant threat from elements of the Islamic faith who believe in a global caliphate. I happen to be a believer. I believe in a monotheistic Christian God. For that reason, I've always taken them seriously. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, who remains at large, is a not insignificant theologian. If you read the fatwas of Al-Qaeda, he actually regards Christians as not being people of the book, because the Trinitarian doctrine, which is more a teaching of the Catholic Church but is adhered to in other Christian faiths as well, that was the fig leaf he used to justify the attack. There was a theological argument about whether we were people of the book before the global jihad that bin Laden signed off on, but the theological brains behind it was Ayman al-Zawahiri. I commend it to you because it's the reason that I also argued within the ADF that counterinsurgency theory would not work against Al-Qaeda or even the Taliban in Afghanistan. I always believed our mission there should have been to destroy the training camps and kill as many of the Taliban leadership as possible. And that was able to be done using remotely piloted aerial system or even or targeted strikes from carrier groups in the Indian Ocean using a minimal special forces footprint, as we did very effectively up to about February 2002. We could have declared mission over. I never once, and I'm on the record in this and can prove it, and Greg Sheridan will verify it, I argued within government and the ADF as early as 2007 that counterinsurgency would not work in Afghanistan because they weren't for sale. If you look at the history of that beleaguered country, the uprising in Herat actually occurred when the puppet regime put male teachers in schools teaching young girls. Not only did they object to girls being sent to secular schools, they objected to men teaching girls. That's what sparked the Soviet invasion. And there's a terrific book, Afghanistan, on that particular deployment. Anyway, I'm digressing somewhat, but that is to give you the context that I'm not for a moment gainsaying the fact that we need a counter-terrorism capability that I believe should be military rather than civilian police. I don't believe the police do it well. I think those two very fine soldiers to whom I refer to correct. I'd rather have a highly quarantined, constitutionally approved military capability to kill terrorists than to see our police become paramilitary police. I think that's a great threat to civil society. But the journey upon which we have embarked, and which largely has occurred by stealth, because I can confess to you, until I was asked to present this tonight, I did not know the scope of that legislation until I started to delve, in that every job that I went on, including the Commonwealth Games role, I undertook in good faith, thinking smarter people than I was had all these matters in hand. But there has been very, very substantial mission creep in what is contained in legislation that went through with bipartisan support and is on the statute books. But I believe that that the current call out is constitutionally unsound. Whether it is worthy of challenge remains a matter for others. But I personally feel for my colleagues, and I can tell you without naming names, many of them are as discomforted about this as I am, on both loss of training time and reputation grounds. Some feel that General Fruin has been used to prop up a poor vaccine rollout. I know that's not his view, I might add. He's been delighted to apply the skills that he's got to the national effort. And again, at the lower end of infringements. That is at the lower end. But what does concern me is de facto policing by even unarmed soldiers, sailors and airmen, use of them in quarantine enforcement, where, by the way, they do not have any policing powers at all. This is the great paradox. They don't have the power to detain someone who chooses to leave a quarantined hotel, and yet, without being called out by the state under the Constitution, as was intended by the founders, under a slightly different scenario, armed troops could be called to an incident and fire on a crowd of Australians and employ lethal force. I find that scenario deeply, deeply disturbing. I think it is unconstitutional. And on that note, I think I've probably spoken far too long. I'd be very happy now to hand back to you, Xavier, to moderate this, and I'm happy to take comments or questions. And if I'm in error, please draw it to my attention.